So welcome back to this last module, Module 6, around continuous improvement. So this module is done in the backdrop of Modules 1 to 5, where we set up the Recovery Coordination Group, assessed the impacts and the needs, we've agreed recovery actions, we've agreed renewal initiatives, and now it's about thinking of what are the lessons that we've learned from this experience, and how are we going to make sure that the next time we have to establish a recovery and renewal group, we are able to do so a little bit more effectively. So here it's about, or one of the first tasks is about identifying lessons. And there's often a great temptation to take a very holistic approach of trying to involve the whole system, about learning about where impacts have been and how they have been effective. Obviously, there's a need to think about how do we enhance that whole system, but we have some words of caution to keep it proportionate. Obviously, what you're trying to do is to understand how do you improve for the next emergency. And so there is a temptation perhaps to think about how do we get lessons from everyone, from everywhere, everyone who was impacted. Running citizen surveys, involving the supply chain, talking to businesses, bringing in different departments within your organisation. And whilst that is an excellent approach and probably the height of good practice, it might deliver you with so much information that it's difficult to see what the trends are that are emerging from all of that. We know that looking at frontline, looking at support management service and the strategic functions is where a lot of the learning is going to be as to how do you improve the resilience partnership. So you just need to define very carefully where you're wanting to identify lessons from, rather than fall into collecting every lesson from everyone. But there are some ways in which we can collect lessons, David.
Yeah, so a variety of ways you might identify the key points to learn after an incident. The most obvious ones I can think are the operational or strategic debriefs. So after action reviews, looking back on what's happened, hot debriefs that can be useful for therapeutic reasons as well as operational understanding. And then debriefing the recovery and the renewal activities that you do over a long period of time. Impact needs assessments we've spoken about before in a previous module. But looking at those chronic pre-crisis needs and then system-wide impacts that may emerge or indeed become prolonged after the event itself. You can also look for external support, so peer reviews, for example. It's not unusual to see a number of areas exchange their experiences and independently review each other's activities can be a very valuable additional action. And then into looking for international equivalence, which is where I think the Manchester briefing has been particularly helpful, learning from international lessons from other countries who've dealt with the same problems in maybe slightly different ways, but have learned some interesting lessons.
And then who do you identify lessons from? Well, resilience partners and other responders are obviously a key part of that. They will have experience on the ground and they'll know what it is that they'll want to change about their systems. There are other partners, people who have received the services from them, members of the public, officials. They might all have a perspective on this. As David said, local international practitioners with other experiences or experiences of the same emergencies, and then other actors in the system. And the small graphic suggests that you can look and collect lessons at any level of your system, whether it's an individual worker or right up to the whole nation and every level in between. And again, just the words of caution of trying to collect every lesson from every different level might mean that you just collect too much information and you're not able to see what the big lessons are, what the major things are that you should be addressing as a result of this work.
The useful components of a resilient system that you should learn lessons from. And we've suggested that self-assessment might be a useful way of approaching this. Indeed, if you look into the ISO, we've presented a toolkit which we think can be used to achieve the outcomes on this slide. So taking you through from left to right, the key elements of the system, delivery of operations. I won't go through each one in detail. Coordination and communication of operations, management systems, intelligence, strategy, vision and leadership. And then under each one, you'll see there are specific pointers with their own assessment questions within the toolkit. If you were to look across all 5, then we would suggest that you'll have a comprehensive overview of how you've dealt with the emergency, the crisis, the disaster, and how to learn lessons from them.
Then you can start thinking in clause 6.3 of the international standard, start thinking about how do you act on those lessons. So how do you make sure that once you've identified those lessons that you actually do something about them? So it's about trying to embed good performance and addressing underperformance. And so part of this reflections exercise is understanding those performance issues. It's about recording how lessons have been addressed already, so that if there is an inquiry, if there is some public review, then you're able to defend what you've done differently as a result of your experience of the crisis. And then sharing actions much more widely than just the Resilience Partnership, so that others can learn and can identify how they can improve as a result of the learning that you've had.
But then planning exercising to either embed or help embed those lessons, or indeed prepare for future crisis based on your most recent experience, becomes incredibly important, not only because it stress tests your preparedness and resilience for different risks, but it allows you to challenge, if you like, some of the planning assumptions that you now need to revise on the back of your learning lessons, actually test your plans, rehearse key roles for people, and then exercise those capabilities that help you achieve response, recovery, and renewal. So identifying improvements that will strengthen preparedness, identify new information needs, identify the system pressures within future crisis. And it's particularly important, we think, to test these to the kind of worst case scenario level to make sure you're absolutely prepared. Ensure recovery and renewal actions can help in future crisis. Strengthen partnership, of course, because each exercise builds on the relationship, the knowledge of each other and each other's cultures and ways of working, and then eventually builds confidence that your system is resilient.
You can obviously take this much further than we've discussed so far, which is starting to think about alternative futures, alternative ways in which the emergency could adapt and change. So understand how that evolution could happen, looking at and considering conditions that you haven't encountered before, that you perhaps think are beyond reasonable case scenario, and as David said, looking at worst case, just exploring different scenarios in order to identify what can you learn from that, what can the plans satisfactorily address, and what might they need to be amended in order to scale up to a higher level, and then evaluate as to how do these actions begin to build a more resilient society.
Okay, so to summarize, we've given you a good overview, I think, about how you can learn lessons in a slightly more holistic way. And it's important to remind you that identifying lessons is very different from actually applying or learning those lessons and building resilience, which of course is the end game for everybody here. And it's probably also important to remind you that you can both learn these lessons either throughout a prolonged incident. If you think about COVID, the ability to learn lessons constantly over 2 years has been incredibly important to improve the services that were delivered over a period of time, or indeed you can do it at the end of a very short-term incident. But we also think, as before, it's quite important to just pose a few questions for you. So again, under our category 6, continuous improvement, what capabilities should be renewed for the next event? What learning lessons, what lessons will you need to learn for public inquiry? 2 little prompt questions, I think, just to get you thinking beyond the module itself. And Duncan, I think you've got a very useful aid memoir.
That's right. So this is very much the international standard on a page. So ISO 22393. And the different phases that you might want to work through. So we've got a module on phase 1, the concepts on setting up a recovery coordination group in phase 2, through to the impact needs assessment, the recovery plan, the renewal initiatives, and then this module that we've talked about, phase 6, learning to act and to improve. Of course, trying to develop recovery and renewal plans is not easy. We know that. We've worked with a number of local government organisations that have been taking their groups through this, We've had the pleasure of learning from their experience and encapsulating all of that into this series of modules. We're going to be continuing to do this work, and we'll be working with a range of cities and local governments in implementing 22393 and the principles that are contained in there to help them to recover and renew following COVID and other emergencies. So I think it just falls on us to, again, thank you for participating in these modules. This is a project that we've been running for the last 18 months. It's been funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and the University of Manchester. David, thank you for joining me in these workshops and these modules. And I hope for the audience listening at home, I hope that this has been really useful. Yeah, thank you so much, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.